Welcome to the end of day 4 of the 2021 Vermont Organics Recycling Summit, organized by the Composting Association of Vermont in partnership with the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources. This year's summit is being held during the International Compost Awareness Week. The tagline for this year is Grow, Eat, Compost, Repeat. The International Compost Awareness Week is the largest and most comprehensive education initiative of the composting industry. So we're really excited to be pairing up with them and sharing in this week of celebration. I'd like to give a huge shout out to the sponsors of this virtual summit. That includes Community Bank, Eco Products, Vermont Natural Ag Products, Addison County Solid Waste Management District, AgriLab Technologies, EcoPixel, Nature Cycle, the Vermont Produce Program from the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets, and the Eco-AmeriCorps program from the Department of Environmental Conservation. Our featured sponsor today is Nature Cycle, and unfortunately Chuck Dupre wasn't able to join us for this session at the last minute, but I just wanted to highlight Nature Cycle. They provide all your compost and engineered soil needs. They offer landscapers, site contractors, retailers, and institutions materials to build high-quality athletic fields, create better topsoils, or grow green roofs. They have a sales force that is experienced and has a strong resume of successful projects. Nature Cycle works with people like you to restore the earth, and you can learn more about them at naturecycle.com. So again, huge thanks to Chuck and Nature Cycle for being one of the sponsors for this summit. Before we get into today's program, I just have 2 announcements. As part of VOR's week, the Composting Association of Vermont is launching a multi-generational statewide art challenge called Changing Lives Through Compost, One Scrap at a Time. I worked with CAV members Paul and Winsong Kervik to create a 2021 food scrap story calendar that featured photographs of the different designs that they saw emerging in their countertop food scrap bucket. Seeing this calendar on her grandmother's wall, 4-year-old Neoma actually wanted to do her own food scrap art, and she used yard debris and food scraps to make a bunch of her own artwork. There's more examples of her art on the CAV website. And so we're really inspired by all of this creativity and thought this was a great opportunity for an outreach and education campaign in Vermont, especially with the with the universal recycling law that is now in full effect as of last July. So we have a bunch of fantastic partners here. There are a lot of different ways that you can get involved if you'd like to, and you can learn more at compostingvermont.org/foodscrapart. Or you can contact me directly. And so here we are in the last slot of Thursday's program. It's the Us Composting Council's zoning session, the Compost Entrepreneurs Challenge. Linda is the advocacy director for the Us Composting Council and was staff to the Model Zoning Template Task Force. Marcus is the chair of this task force and an award-winning Us Composting Council member. He serves as vice chair of the Minnesota Solid Waste Administrators Association and is a senior environmentalist for Carver County Environmental Services in Minnesota. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to you guys.
So hello, friends. I am coming to you from, I'll say happy International Compost Awareness Week from Maryland, which is where I am located, where we have all kinds of zoning challenges of our own in my own county and in my own state. So I have firsthand knowledge, like all of you, of the difficult hill to climb that zoning can be for anyone in our field. And I'm also glad I wanted to say, since Chuck couldn't be here, Chuck Dupre is a member of USCC, and he does really great work, especially in compost use and really promoting and evangelizing for compost use. So I'm glad to know that he sponsored. So with that, I will go ahead and get started. So our presentation is about our model compost zoning ordinance that has been worked on for almost 2 years now, maybe a little bit more. Marcus may tell you. I am more new to the scene of it in the past year, but Marcus has been there for the long haul. So first, I want to tell you about the US Composting Council in case you don't know of us, although I'm sure most of you do. We have been around since 1990 when we started out as the Solid Waste Composting Council. And by 1992, we realized that composting solid waste, our forebears, was not going to produce a great product. So we became focused on source separation, and we became the US Composting Council. So to that end, you can see that our mission does focus on compost manufacturing and use. And, we are focused very, very much on compost's part in healthy soils and in stable climate and climate change mitigation and overall a sustainable society. So we always are reminding people that composting is not just about diverting from the landfill. It's more or as much about creating healthy soil. I always like to give people some idea of who our members are, and we have about 770 organizations, almost 2,000 people represented from individuals all the way to large companies. And this gives you a little bit of a sense. The primary membership that we have is compost manufacturers. And I would say a little more than half of those are private sector compost manufacturers, and then the rest obviously are public sector. And I left it on this slide from a presentation that I made a couple of weeks ago, a similar presentation, but it was to a group of community composters in Atlanta. And for that presentation, I did a little bit of digging, and I know that community composting is very much alive in Vermont. And we had a couple of years ago, we did not have a lot of community composters back in 2018, and we have grown about 25% per year in the number of members in that sector. Some are collection only, some are a combination of composting and collection. And this is just a really growing scale of composting in the US, as you already know, and we are seeing it reflected on our side as well. We also have a program called the Seal of Testing Assurance, and because of that, it's a participation program where compost users can actually test, and we track what they're testing and that they have a pass-fail and their compost is testing. So we have started compiling data, so you can see some of that really fascinating data that all together we're producing through these STA compost manufacturers over 10 million cubic yards of compost a year in the 37 states where they exist. And this is, I think that 3/4 of our compost manufacturers are STA, so that means there's even more out there that's not STA and more that are not even members, which we hope you'll all be a member. I should make a little pitch for that. So that's kind of our impact. So I'm going to jump into the zoning project. So why did we take on a zoning project? Well, a couple of years ago, we started to do a lot of research into compost deserts, what we like to call compost deserts, large areas of the country where there is no composting going on at all, outside of perhaps backyard composting, or maybe yard trim composting, but no food scrap composting happening, or maybe not even any. And we started to survey, especially municipalities. We focused on municipalities because they have flow control over the waste in their communities. So we knew they would be the ones to know what was going on, what should be going on, what they wish was going on in terms of composting. So we did our first survey in 2018. And one of the big takeaways that we had many, many takeaways, but one of the big takeaways that we had from the communities that did not have any composting infrastructure existing was that they were really not interested in getting into food scrap composting. They may have had yard trim composting, but they certainly did not have, for various reasons, the thought that their community was going to embrace food scrap composting. So what they told us is that they very much would like to see composting come into their communities through the private sector. which is a good song to sing to us since we have many, many private sector composters in the Us Composting Council. So what did they tell us? They said in some senses they were open to a situation where they would provide the land and a composter would operate, which is also a composter's dream, not to have to go siting land. Or it might be vice versa, where they might be running the facility and someone would be doing the pickup of the organic materials. So we really took away that private sector facilities have a very important future in our country. So just a few answers here, just to highlight across the board the different things people were saying. You know, some were saying private facility on municipal property, like I said. Some were saying they don't see their facility that they have being able to expand, or there may even be a private facility that they see could not expand. So in our second survey, we dug in a little bit more and asked what types of resources that they thought they might need in order to help to bridge this gap. And you will be hearing about our Target Organics project over the next year. We're getting ready to actually launch our beta hub on our website. But part of our Target Organics project is having model ordinances and tools for municipalities in this first stage to use. And the model zoning was one of those, because we found that they told us that there was limited processing capacity, limited sites available, limited zoning and land use possibilities for composting in their communities. So, you know, there were many, as you can see, many obstacles, from hauling costs and low tipping fee rates and things like that, things that we're trying to tackle on other ends. But one of the pieces that really seemed doable for us was a zoning ordinance. So we started to think about how to pull that together and what kind of resources it would require and what problems we would be solving through that. One of the big problems that we've seen along the way that needs to be solved through zoning in communities is clarity. And, you know, I get Google alerts, maybe some of you do on various topics, but I have all kinds of composting Google alerts. And it seems like at least once a week, I'm getting some Google alert from some community where somebody is having a fight with their community about zoning. And the one that I have here, it was a guy in Martha's Vineyard, and he actually was on their town council, and he had a farm, and he decided that he thought because he had a farm that he should be by right allowed to start a compost facility. And I guess as his facility grew and more material came, people started complaining, and he wound up in a fight. And it turned out that he did not actually have that zoning by right outlined in the ordinance. So, you know, it gives people clarity to know when you start out on the path, what you're getting into. Another reason that we found, this guy in this picture here is Aniel Arroyo Rodriguez, and he is on our zoning task force, and he is from the Ohio EPA and has done some really great work there on composting ordinances and permitting, et cetera. And he had talked about, this quote is from an article in BioCycle, and in the article, he talked about how the state law definition of solid waste facilities was supposed to include composting facilities, but the locality did not interpret it that way. They tried to explain to them that composting was included, but because their zoning was not clear about that, the facility got turned down. So, you know, clarity that a composting facility is different from solid waste and it should be allowed is another big thing we can accomplish through a zoning ordinance. Another thing that the zoning ordinance will help us going forward, and what you're going to hear Marcus tell you about, is that community composting is not well defined in terms of impact. And here I'm in a picture here with one of the folks from Rust Belt Riders out in Cleveland. And, you know, in a lot of ordinances, small compost facilities are getting treated the same way, not only as, solid waste facilities, but as large compost facilities, and their impact on the community is very different. So we need to educate zoning officials about those differences. The other thing is we need to educate the regulators before the facility gets to the zoning board. One of the challenges that composters have, number one, is if you're taking in an application to ask to be located in a community, that's enough of a lift in itself. That's a tough challenge. But if you have to go into the community either beforehand or at the same time, depending on the process of the community, to put in a zoning ordinance, that's a double lift. So we realize that we can do favors for our composters by actually making the first part of that lift for them, and you'll hear more about that, by creating the zoning ordinance and encouraging the communities to adopt these zoning ordinances before the facilities come. Another thing that we've heard from people is that on-farm composting also is running into some challenges, and I know Vermont has its own challenges around various aspects of on-farm composting. But one of the themes that we heard is that when on-farm composters want to expand and take material from off-site, either to diversify their revenue stream or increase the organic matter that they can put on their farms, they're being limited from bringing in outside materials. So we wanted to help to solve that problem. And lastly, we felt that we needed to help these zoning officials, the few that we've talked to. I know here in Frederick County, when we put in our farm zoning ordinance in our county, a group of advocates, we worked on that. And the thing the guy told us, he's like, write this ordinance for me. I don't know anything about composting. I mean, he pretty much told us that. He said, you tell me what it needs to say, and I'll put the limits on it and get it through if you tell me something that I think is not going to fly, but I have no idea what this is all about. So please write it for me. So they just don't have that expertise. And I think that the help will be much appreciated in communities that know this is coming in their direction. So what did we decide to do? We had all these great reasons and all this demand for resources. So we put together a dream team of our zoning task force. And we decide, actually, first I'll talk to you about who they are. You're going to hear from Marcus, who's from Minnesota. Brian Freeman, second from the left, is an attorney from a firm that specializes in solid waste and recycling issues. And he's been a great help from the legal side. Jorge Montezuma, he actually was a regulator previously, and he's now with Us Organics, and he focuses on engineering and siting new facilities. So he has a great wealth of knowledge. Neil Edgar is an advocate in California and a specialist in this area, and he has brought a lot of knowledge because California is far ahead of a lot of other communities in terms of how these things are approached. I mentioned Aniel, and then Courtney Brown, we recruited because she has a great knowledge of community composting and has done a lot of research in the legal side of composting. So what we did is our group met at least monthly for like the past year, and we narrowed down our focus. We may add more things later on, but we just narrowed down our focus just to get this started on-farm, what we're calling small site, which takes in community composting, vermicomposting in vessel, large site, which is your traditional commercial sites, and consolidation sites, which is when you're exchanging material from truck to truck, from cart to cart. A lot of people are doing this kind of on a handshake, and we thought, well, we'll put some zoning language around it. And how we did this is first we scanned what zoning ordinances existed across the country in composting and started to pull bits and pieces with our own knowledge of what we thought was best practice. And we have gone back and forth with a lot of debate and consensus. Number one, around focusing zoning on land use. You have state permitting rules, and I think Marcus might talk about this more, but the state permitting rules are generally focused on the way sites operate. And we try not to get too deeply into operations and duplicate what state rules are looking at. We focused on land use types of things. And we also tried to be forward looking to make the parameters that we set something that the composting industry can grow into. We didn't want to have to go back later and have people have to, amend the zoning ordinance because now we're finding compost sites should be bigger or what have you. So we tried to be forward looking in the limits that we set. Marcus is going to take over on the meat and potatoes of the zoning ordinance that is almost finished.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to share the work the U.S. Composting Council has been doing with the development of the model zoning template for compost facilities. As Natasha mentioned, I work for Carver County as a senior environmentalist. Carver County is located 25 miles southwest of Minneapolis. My duties there include managing solid waste programs such as household hazardous waste, recycling, as well as composting, including organics diversion. I serve on as vice chair of the Minnesota Composting Council board, and as Linda mentioned, I'm chair of the Zoning Task Force, which is actually a subcommittee of the U.S. Composting Council Legislative Environmental Affairs Committee, also known as LEAC. That committee advocates for compost-friendly legislation policy at the national, state, and local levels. I provided this timeline to show you when the zoning template project began and when it is scheduled to be completed. The zoning committee was formed by LEAC in April of 2020 for the purposes of drafting the template. And as Linda mentioned, it probably went further back than that with some discussion at the LEAC group before that committee was formed. The committee has met once or twice per month until the first draft was completed in early November of 2020. The draft was then sent for stakeholder review and comment, which were accepted through December. The stakeholders were made up of USCC members as well as zoning professionals. The draft was then sent for stakeholder review and comments, which were accepted through December. Okay, edits were based on the comments, and those were completed early last month, actually. USCC has contracted with the American Planning Association to provide input on the template, and the draft has been sent to them, and we hope to have their feedback by the end of the month. We intend to send out the document for a second round of stakeholder review and have final edits completed in early June. And we anticipate the final version will be posted on the USCC website sometime in July. Before I begin discussing the specifics related to the model ordinance, I would like to take a step back and talk about what initiated USCC's interest in the model zoning language. Since traditional recycling diversion rates have plateaued, organics composting has become increasingly more important to help local governments meet landfill diversion goals. So counties and cities have established successful organics collection systems such as residential curbside and drop-off sites, commercial pickup, as well as school and event collection programs. In many cases, the capacity at the compost sites have not kept up with the growing volumes of the SSOM. And this has created a need to locate new facilities to manage the additional material. USCC has received numerous requests for model language, as Linda had mentioned, and has also has been identified as a need on the member surveys that have been sent out. Many states have begun addressing the need for expanding compost capacity by revising their rules. I was involved in that process in Minnesota, which resulted in new rules being passed in 2015. The new rules in Minnesota expanded the types of facilities from 2 to 4. Initially, Minnesota permitted only 2, mixed municipal solid waste composting facilities and yard waste sites. The MSW sites were very expensive and difficult to permit, And that technology is now obsolete since no one really uses that process anymore. And the second type was yard waste sites, which have minimal regulation, but do not allow for source separate organic material as a feedstock. The new rules added 2 additional facilities, small sites and source separated organic composting facilities, both of which allowed for composting organics. The source separated material sites are easier to permit with less stringent regulations than had been for the MSW sites. And the small sites, which here in Minnesota allow for 120 cubic yards, are exempt from state permits. So soon after the new rules were passed in Minnesota, the Minnesota Composting Council developed a model ordinance intended to be a tool for local governing authorities to assist in the development of language for the new small sites. The Minnesota Composting Council expected each community to modify the specific requirements to their own community needs and zoning codes. So when that was going on, I was also serving on the LEAC committee, and I made the suggestion that they develop a similar document to help units of government with zoning ordinance development for the larger and ag sites. So this document would dovetail nicely with what the model rules that the USCC developed for states when they are looking at revising their rules. So the difference between the Minnesota sort of version and the USCC model template, the main thing is it intends to provide a guidance for city and county planners who are updating their codes. But the difference is that the USCC version includes various composting operations, sizes, and facility types. Having model language that has been developed by professionals in the composting field and input from the Association of American Planners can make public hearings, like the one you see on the screen there, I believe that was a hearing in Maryland, a lot easier. And the same with the adoption of new zoning regulations. So the objective of this model ordinance is to establish composting as a distinct land use due to its unique operational characteristics, encourage diversion of communities' organic material as a resource that can be used rather than landfill, and outline the best practices for compost operations to benefit the community with well-operating facilities. I would like to share an example of a composting facility in my county which was forced to deal with issues related to location and operations. This was a typical municipal yard waste site that was converted over to an SSOM site through a state research and demonstration project permit. Under the permit, we had to collect contact water samples for the MPCA to help them gain an understanding of potential environmental impacts. But this is one of the first sites that was operating in the Twin City metro area. So the site was initially permitted for 20,000 cubic yards on site at any one time. But as the source separate organic material collection programs started taking off, the demand for capacity grew. And as a result, the operator actually processed during his last year of operation there at around 60,000 cubic yards annually. As the volume increased, so did the concerns of neighbors, and their complaints also increased. After several enjoyable meetings with the neighbors and the site operator and property owner, we all agreed to move the site to a more remote location. This aerial photo shows where the site was relocated to mitigate neighbors' concerns. The top left is the original location. You can't really see it very well, but the homes were located within 200 feet from the edge of the site, basically just across the road. There was minimal screening from the road. The operator failed to stockpile sufficient carbon feedstock to mix with his high volumes of SSOM material. And he turned the piles frequently to speed up the composting process, both of which created odor issues. So at the new location on the lower right, the nearest neighbors were about 1,900 feet away from the site. The site could not be seen from the road, and the volumes of materials were decreased to not more than 20,000 annually. And they also incorporated forced aeration in the management system to minimize the turning and odor creation. This site has now operated for 8 years without a single complaint. And this illustrates how locating a site in the proper area can eliminate problems for everyone involved. I would now like to talk about the contents of the model ordinance. When Linda told me that we were doing this presentation earlier in the year, we thought the document would be completed by the time we gave the talk. So as a result, the discussion we have will be more general in nature since the specific language has still not been completed. So the document does include language collected from existing zoning ordinances from around the US, which address the following sizes. The small scale sites, also referred to as community or decentralized composting. Large scale, also referred to as industrial or commercial composting. Agricultural, also referred to as on-farm. And later on in the process, we added language for consolidation sites, or also referred to as organics transfer stations. So in the document, each of these facility type sections have the following components. We have location requirements, operational standards, permit requirements, and a land use table. And the committee believes that every city and county has unique circumstances and that this document provides a starting point that can be modified to fit individual situations. So local jurisdictions should select only those sections that are appropriate for them and modify them according to their own needs. Well, this presentation, I added a slide that's not in here, so I'll just kind of cover it. And that's discussing the definitions, which is the first section of the document. It is important to define terms to ensure that the code intents are clearly understood. For the individuals who have no experience with land use or zoning terms, like myself, I only started working on this project like a year ago, or 2 years ago. So that's when I first started getting into the code language. So we also, for those type of folks, we also added definitions commonly appearing in zoning codes. In addition, we, of course, added terms that are related to the composting operations themselves. For example, though, if you, as far as zoning terms, terms such as allowed by right, which is a term referring to a property owner's use of the property in a manner consistent with that which is listed permissible in the zoning district where the property is located. So those are the type of additional terms that we added into that particular section. So, but after definitions were defined, the first actual section we start with is the small sites. Small sites are typically located at schools, community centers, gardens, or urban agricultural sites and colleges. These sites conduct composting as an accessory use or at a private residence during processing only organic material generated on site. These sites have seen growth over the past few years as urban agriculture movement has increased in popularity. And the model zoning ordinance breaks out the small sites into the following categories: allowed by right, exempt, and permitted. So with the allowed by right category are those with less than 20 cubic yards of material on site at any one time and is conducted as an accessory use activity and or is managed only organic material generated on site and using the finished compost on site. These are allowed by right and are exempt from all zoning and land use permit requirements. The exempt sites refer to ones that are between 20 yards and 120 cubic yards on site at any one time and is conducted as an accessory use activity or in vessel or is managing only organic material generated on site using the finished compost on site. They are required to notify the local zoning and planning department of the proposed use activity prior to commencing operation, but are not required to undergo full local zoning administrative review and permit application process. So the amount of material for this category is still a point of debate with our committee. And I anticipate it may increase after the review of our second round of stakeholder comments. So I'll stay tuned on that one. The third and final type of small sites is the permitted. And this category includes those that have between 100 cubic yards and 1,000 cubic yards of material on site at any one time, and less than 5,000 cubic yards annually, and may require these may require a conditional use permit. A conditional use permit is a zoning exemption that allows a property owner to use land in such a way that is not typically permitted with a particular zoning district. So a land use table like this is included with each category. Along the top of the table, we list the zoning classifications, including industrial, residential, agriculture, and commercial. Along the left side of the table, we list the specific sites, and then we fill the chart in with the permit requirements. So for example, a small composting facility designated as permitted in the table is required to get a conditional use permit in residential or commercial zones after local zoning administrative review, but is allowed by right in land that is zoned industrial. Large sites is the next section in the document. These sites are usually subject to state permitting regulations and a site plan approval. They face greater or more stricter state regulations regarding nuisance activities such as dust, vector, and stormwater management. The zoning committee made the decision to break out the large facility section into three categories. Open air, which are the most common. The in-vessel, which takes place in a controlled batch with airtight vessel that can be moved and emptied by roll-off trucks. In-vessel composting systems are commonly controlled to optimize decomposition. They meet regulatory requirements and minimize odor. And then the final one is the enclosed building or the under roof type of facility. So as I had mentioned, each of the facility types sections also include language related to location requirements, operations, acceptable and prohibited materials, and permit requirements. Under location requirements, we list setbacks from property lines, dwellings, surface water, and wells, and include language regarding restrictions in floodplains. In the operations sections, we include language regarding how the facility must conduct operations in a manner that will minimize creation of nuisance, such as odors, dust, and noise. We also list buffer and visual screening requirements, such as acceptable material for earthen berms or fencing, and what type of vegetation screening is acceptable. We also list acceptable or prohibited materials for each type. Acceptable materials include items such as food scraps, compostable food packaging, yard waste, and non-recyclable paper. So this is the land use table for the large sites. And this is the current layout of that table. So an example of an open air facility would need a special use permit in an area zoned light manufacturing and would not be allowed at all in a residential zoned area. So basically a person can look at what facility they'd like to site and then in what area, and it determines what type of permit they would be looking for. So now we go into the agricultural sites. So farms have a critical role to play in producing and utilizing compost to restore depleted soils. Permitting exemptions authorize compost operations on farms to avoid excessive permitting requirements intended for large, full-scale composting facilities. Because there are often significantly less risks or hazards associated with agricultural composters, many states have incorporated permit exemptions into their composting regulations for such cases. The model ordinance currently has the ag facilities broken out into the following categories: under 1,000 cubic yards, 1,000 to 5,000, over 5,000, and then a special category for vermicomposting. Each has varying degrees of local oversight. If we look at the land use table for ag sites, for example, an agricultural compost facility that operates with in quantities between 1,000 and 5,000 cubic yards on site at one time is considered an accessory agricultural activity and is allowed by right in an agricultural zoned area, but requires a permit in rural residential areas, for example. So the last type of section we have is, as I mentioned, is the consolidation or pre-processing sites. The interest for collecting and diverting food waste and organics materials continues to increase nationwide. However, locations for organic generators are not always favorable to the efficient collection route densities or resulting in increased transportation costs. The cost of transportation is a well-known factor that increases the cost of food waste diversion and recycling and prevents public and private organizations from participating in food waste recycling efforts. So a promising solution to this transportation efficiency issue is the cost barriers is the establishment of organic waste consolidation facilities that function as a feedstock hub for collection of organic prior to the delivery to a composting facility. These consolidation facilities could range from a neighborhood food waste drop-off site, very simple method, to a more complicated enclosed building with depackaging and then sorting equipment. So this shows an example of a drop-off, which are the simplest form of consolidation. It consists usually of drop-off containers available to the public, which is placed in convenient locations. The containers are typically residential carts or commercial front load type containers. The container swap can be as simple as a booth at a farmer's market where residents can drop off food waste in buckets and receive a clean container when they come back the following week, or a larger operation where full containers such as 55-gallon totes are collected by trucks and switched out on a scheduled basis with clean containers. Finally, the pre-processing and collection sites consists of both under roof or fully enclosed buildings that includes processing equipment such as depackaging that removes food from the containers, and the consolidation facilities which transfer organics from smaller trucks into larger trucks for transportation to a compost facility. Given that this is a newer use and is expected to encounter growth in the future, USCC provides the guidance with the suggestion for inclusion of these activities in common zoning categories that reflect the level of nuisance and environmental risk posed by these activities. The suggestion reflects that the fact that the environmental regulatory agencies consider these activities as having low environmental impact. The table shows the level of permitting suggested for each consolidation activity in relation to the common land use categories. So for example, on this table, the public drop-off is allowed by right in all zones, while the container swap type of facility is required permits in residential zones. So that kind of completes kind of the nuts and bolts of what we're going to be presenting when this document is always totally complete. But at this point, I'd like to turn it back over to Linda to complete the some additional information she wants to share with us.
So I'm just going to wrap up a little bit about a little bit more about the process and what you can expect and what we're hoping you can help us with. So one piece of information that I wanted to provide was when we started this process, we knew it would be a long process. Actually, I have done some looking at other industries like solar and I forget the other one I looked at. Some of them have had like 10 stakeholders rounds. I mean, I think we're going to be lucky, hopefully, only having 2. But when we started to see that this was going to get a lot more comments and a lot deeper dive than we expected, we had come across this group called Sustainable City Code, and it comes actually from University of Vermont, which is, I just thought about that, from a professor there started it. And it's a collection of environmental codes, permits, white papers about all kinds of things, stormwater, you name it, different environmental things are in there. And they did not have anything about compost zoning or permitting. So we approached them, and actually this project has been funded for things like this from our Corporate Compost Leadership Council, which does want to see closing of infrastructure gaps. So we contracted with them to work with us on a white paper about compost zoning and compost permitting. So let's see, I had the thing and I was going to put it in the chat, and that always takes me a minute. So let me get that there in case you want to look at it while we're talking. All right, I'm really not driving very well here, but I know you will get these slides. So you'll be able to, you can go to sustainablecitycode.org and type in composting, and you'll find this paper and another one that focuses on allowable zones for equipment on farms and small sites for composting, which is kind of a complementary thing, which they had already done. And I think they added more information after working on our project. So we've had comments from people that this is a very useful document for your elected officials and your planning and zoning type people to kind of set a broad context for them in the absence of actually having the model ordinance. So it is something you might want to check out if your community is, if you are trying to cite something in your community, or your community, you're an advocate and you're trying to get your community to get composting going. It's a good thing to give people as an example. So what is next? What's coming with this? Marcus already did kind of give you the timeline. I will mention, it's not on the slide, but we are also redoing our model state permitting ordinance, which came out in 2012, the one that I mentioned early on and that Marcus mentioned, that focuses more on operations issues. And that's the one that we've had 9 states adopt it so far. And it's the one that basically has composting going in tiers, with tier 1 being yard waste and those types of materials, and getting increasingly more complex feedstocks and more complex regulations. And what we found was that we didn't have community composting in that in 2012. It wasn't a thing yet at the time. And there's some other adjustments. So that's going to be coming out as well, a little bit behind this, probably more like fall for summer for stakeholder comments, and fall to holiday time to finish it up. So that's coming out as well. And then right now we just turned over the model ordinance in the form that we have at this point in time to the American Planning Association. And again, that's a CCLC funded project, and they are taking it because at the same time as we said they don't know composting, we don't know zoning. And we wanted to be sure that the wording in this zoning ordinance, this zoning text amendment, when you take it as a compost, you want to cite a compost site and you take it to your zoning person, you want them to be able to look at that and say, yeah, that makes sense to me. I think I could work with this. So we wanted to be sure that that was the reaction that we got from folks when our members started taking this template and shopping it out to their elected officials and zoning people. And we are going to put it out, like we said, one more time for comments to see if, we did a lot of discussion, see if we hit those targets right in terms of sizes. And then lastly, we're going to go on the road with this thing, which being here is kind of a taste of being on the road, because what we want to do is talk about this near and far and get this adopted ahead of the composters coming in to apply for sites, and see if we can get cities and towns to start to institute this as a text amendment into their zoning ordinance. So what we're looking for help from folks is, if the Vermont Association of Planners, or the Vermont Association of Commissioners, or, those types of people, whether they have newsletters, conferences, any way that we can evangelize and get the word out about them needing to get this into their zoning ordinance. You could drop it in the chat or send Marcus or I an email, because we really, really want to spend the summer and the fall getting this out to the world so that this can start to solve some problems for composters. So with that, our information is on this PowerPoint, which I think you're going to get. And feel free to give us a call or an email if you have suggestions or ideas for us. And we thank you for being here and for letting us come to you.
Thank you so much, Linda and Marcus. I will just add that I also, the Composting Association of Vermont is a USCC member, and I do sit on the LEAC Council as well. And so folks can also reach out through me, and I can help facilitate those connections being made. While people are maybe thinking, I'll just mention that we've recently run into some zoning issues, and I of course knew about this project, but hadn't had the time to do a super deep dive. So I really appreciate being walked through a bit more, because we're now dealing with some unfriendly compost zoning issues in one of the towns that I support some community composting on. And we're talking about like 3-bin systems, so micro composting. And what we found in the town of Barre is that the zoning is really anti-compost. Like there's a lot of concerns around odor and animal vectors, and a lot of, I'll just say, a lot of need for outreach and education to the town folks about how this, about best management practices and the technical support that we're providing. Because a lot of the multi-unit complexes are actually, well, a number of them are considering doing composting on site for addressing the organics diversion law in Vermont. And now they're finding that and have actually in some cases started building the 3-bin system because they're definitely exempt from a permitting standpoint from the state, but they're now running into zoning issues. And so I think this will be a really helpful tool, and I plan to workshop it through that community as well, and happy to give feedback.
Yeah, that's one of the things that here in Maryland, there was a company that wanted to put a compost facility in our county, and they went all the way through the state permitting process. They did everything, and they thought they were ready to go, and they forgot about local zoning, and they're stuck.
Yeah, and it really varies, right, from town to town or from county to county. So it's something that's really important to keep an eye on. Brian in the chat said, with other states like New York, New Jersey, and Maryland moving to ban food scraps from landfills, is this where you anticipate these composting site zoning issues to be most visible?
Well, I'll take a first shot at it, and I don't know if Marcus will want to take a shot as well. I'm going to say that I have seen it popping up everywhere. I mean, in all states. So, and this was before these bans were starting to actually take effect. I mean, last year was the year that yours did, and this year's New York's. So I would assume as more compost facilities do try to locate, it just stands to logic that those are the places where this is going to happen. So that's actually a good point, Brian. Maybe we should focus on, considering there's 50 states and there's not time to get to all of them, maybe I should try to take the show to these states first. Because I think, and the other thing I'm hearing from the kinds of things you're saying, it's making me realize is, we have to package this with compost benefits. You don't just get a zoning ordinance passed and get zoning without addressing these issues that people bring up, odors, right, et cetera. And we have to show people that, if you're a composter who's trained and you've been through training programs, you're going to be able to deal with. And sometimes that nothing is good enough for some people, but we do need to address all pieces. Mm-hmm. So Marcus, do you have any thought on that? What's it like in Minnesota?
Adding bans onto organic material, you're going to see more facilities pop up. But you're also going to see facilities increase in locations. Like here in Minnesota, we don't have organics bans, but we have requirements that were passed in certain counties that require haulers to collect organics or have to offer the service to residents. And those are all coming into play here in the next 2 years. So, and we don't have capacity right now for all the material we're collecting now. So at least here in Minnesota, I know we're going to see more facility siting taking place just because of the new regulations requiring them to offer service, residential and commercially. So
interesting. Do you guys, I know we're right at the hour. Do you have time for one more question? Mind hanging on? Okay, great. So Carol asks, do you know how Massachusetts has been doing regarding those over 1 ton regarding the 1 ton per week ban in 2014 for food waste? Seems to be reducing the ban to half a ton. So of course, lots more places, lots of residents in towns are seeing the benefits, and the towns have been subsidizing some of these activities.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know that on the Legislative and Environmental Affairs Committee, which I staff, we had a regulator from Massachusetts on one of our calls and was giving us the lowdown of how things have gone. And he said that there have been a lot less going to the composting sector than they had predicted. A lot more is going to AD than they thought would. And also the same problem that you all are having in Vermont, stuff is going out of state to for depackaging and AD. So it's an issue that we're trying to grapple with. I mean, we were commenting on the New York State regs the last couple of weeks, and it's a really, really tough issue because especially in some urban areas, we're being told that depackaging and transfer combined with pre-processing is almost necessary when there's not a lot of land space to do source separation. So how to balance this growing industry is a real challenge that we're facing.
Yeah, I think we could, the spin as well with the challenges is that it's also, I think, a really exciting time to be in this field and looking at all of this, because there is a lot of growth and change. And I think that there's a real opportunity to be thoughtful at the onset, which I see this zoning, templates also trying to do. Like, so how can we set ourselves up for success as opposed to kind of like just launching ourselves down a hill and then realizing later that, we might have needed elbow pads. So, yeah, well, I think with that, I'm not seeing a lot of other questions in the chat. So, and we are just just about out of time here. So thank you so much, Linda and Marcus. This was a great presentation and deep dive into some of the zoning work that the US Composting Council has done. This is a recorded session, and so some of the information was a little dense. It will be posted in the week or two after the summit is over, but we will also be sharing the slide deck when we post that recording as reference. And again, thanks to Linda and Marcus, thanks to those of you who are able to take some time out of this finally sunny afternoon after a rainy week here to join us for this session. And just a reminder for those who do have some more time to spend with us at the summit, our program continues through tomorrow, and we start at 10 a.m. with engaging a new generation of organics managers. And so on that, we're going to have a look at K through 12 and Eco AmeriCorps volunteers and sort of the new leadership emerging. So we hope you can join us for that. And keep an eye on your inboxes for a link to an online evaluation of the summit after it concludes. Thanks again, everybody, and have a great rest of your day.